500 years before Columbus, the Vikings reached America, and the world didn't notice. Not because the voyage failed, not because the sailors turned back, but because a discovery in any meaningful sense is not an event. It is a question about the civilization that made it. What separates a landing that reshapes the world from one that disappears into silence is never the courage of the man who stepped ashore. It is the institutions, the networks, the machinery of state and capital and ambition that either follow through on what he found or don't. The Vikings had the ships. They had the skill. What they didn't have was a world capable of doing anything with what they reached. Scandinavia in the 9th and 10th centuries was not a place. It was a disposition. 3 peninsulas, a scattering of islands, and a coastline so long and so fractured by fjord and inlet that no single king had ever held it whole. The people who lived there, Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, all speaking variants of the same language, all bound by the same inherited customs, shared a world that had never been unified and had never needed to be. They were extraordinary at nearly everything that required a man, a ship, and an open horizon. The machinery of civilization, the kind that builds empires, holds territory, and turns discovery into dominion, was something they had not yet built. The basic unit of Viking life was the farmstead. A longhouse, a strip of tillable ground, animals for the winter, kin for protection. Most people who lived in Scandinavia during the Viking Age spent their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born, farming the same land their fathers had farmed, bound by the same obligations their grandfathers had carried. The raids and the voyages that fill the historical record were real, but they were the work of a minority. The majority stayed behind, tending cattle and cutting peat, living in a world that had no use for abstractions like sovereignty or imperial mandate. Power in this world ran through people, not institutions. A jarl, a lord, a chieftain, held authority because farmers chose to recognize it. His wealth came from land and from the loyalty of men who could, in principle, withdraw that loyalty and go elsewhere. There were no permanent bureaucracies, no standing armies answerable to a crown, no tax apparatus extracting surplus from the countryside to fund state projects. Authority was personal, negotiated, and perpetually contingent on the willingness of free men to accept it. A Viking chieftain who lost the confidence of his followers had nothing left to lead. The thing was the closest thing Viking society had to a governing institution. Free men gathered at fixed intervals, at the local thing, the regional thing, and in Iceland, the Althing, to settle disputes, recite laws, and reach decisions by consensus. It was a remarkable system for a society organized at human scale, producing a legal culture of genuine sophistication. But the thing had no executive arm. It could declare a man an outlaw. It could not enforce the decision. Everything that did not resolve through negotiation resolved through feud. The system was built for a world without a state, because that was exactly the world it inhabited. And religion did not fill the institutional vacuum. The gods of the Norse, Odin, Thor, Freyr, a pantheon of deities tied to weather, war, fertility, and fate, were not organized into a church. There was no priestly caste holding authority across regions, no ecclesiastical hierarchy accumulating land and capital, no religious institution capable of sanctifying a colonial enterprise on behalf of a civilization. Worship happened at home, at seasonal feasts, at local shrines. A chieftain often served a priestly function for his own community. Beyond that, the gods belonged to everyone and no one, which meant they could be invoked to justify a voyage, but they could not be mobilized to sustain one. The economy of Viking Scandinavia ran primarily on agriculture and raiding, and on the trade that grew from both. Furs, amber, walrus ivory. And slaves moved along Baltic and river routes into the markets of Francia, Byzantium, and the Caliphate. Silver flooded back in enormous quantities. But this was a dispersed, kinship-managed commerce, not a capitalized merchant economy in any institutional sense. Wealth accumulated in the hands of chieftains and successful raiders, but it was redistributed through feasting, gift-giving, and the maintenance of personal followings. It did not pool into investment capital. It did not build infrastructure. It was consumed almost entirely in sustaining the social bonds that produced it. There was surplus manpower in Viking Age Scandinavia. More young men than the farmsteads could absorb, more ambition than the local thing could contain. This was the engine of expansion. Men left because staying offered too little land, and too little silver, too little prospect of carving a reputation that would survive them. The raids on Lindisfarne in 793, on Paris in 845, on the monasteries of Ireland in the decades that followed, these were not state projects. They were the collective decision of groups of men who had weighed their options and chosen the sea. The political structures behind them were minimal. The motivation was entirely personal. The kingdoms that existed in Scandinavia during the Viking Age were real but fragile. Denmark, under the Jelling dynasty in the 10th century, came closest to something resembling a centralized state, a king with genuine authority, a developing church, a military force answerable to a crown. Norway and Sweden were still consolidating, their kings more itinerant political leaders than heads of permanent governing structures. The process of state formation was underway, but it was incomplete. At the moment Leif Erikson sailed west toward Vinland around the year 1000, the Scandinavian world was in mid-transformation, neither the fully stateless society of 2 centuries earlier nor the consolidated monarchies it would become. Christianity was beginning to change that calculus. When a Viking king converted and Harald Bluetooth in Denmark, Olaf Tryggvason in Norway, and others did so across the late 10th and early 11th centuries, he gained something that paganism could not provide: institutional infrastructure. A church meant bishops with administrative capacity, literate clerks who could record laws, a moral framework that sanctioned royal authority as divinely ordained rather than merely negotiated. And Christianity offered something the thing and the kinship network never could: the idea that authority transcended the individual who held it. But in 1000 AD, this transformation was still in its early stages across much of Scandinavia. The world that produced Leif Erikson was, in almost every structural sense, at the outer edge of the medieval European world, not its periphery in terms of capability. The ships were extraordinary, the navigational knowledge was real, the seamanship was without equal in the North Atlantic. But peripheral in the institutional sense that matters for empire building: no sovereign capable of mandating a colonial enterprise, no church capable of legitimizing one, no financial machinery capable of funding one across decades, no bureaucratic apparatus capable of administering one once it existed. Yet these were not failures. They were simply the character of a civilization that had never needed any of those things to be what it was. What Viking society had built, it had built for itself and its own conditions, dispersed across islands and peninsulas and fjords that no single army could easily dominate, governed by assembly and kinship and the personal authority of respected men. It had produced a culture of extraordinary individual capability. A Norse farmer who settled Iceland or Greenland was resourceful, resilient, and almost entirely self-sufficient. He could build a house, manage livestock, navigate by the stars, and defend his family without any help from a state, because there was no state to help him. That self-sufficiency was the greatest strength the Viking world had produced. It was also, when the challenge was not a new island but a continent, a structural limitation it could not transcend. The Viking world had one more quality that shaped everything that followed. It reproduced itself outward, westward, always westward, not by design, not by royal decree, but by the steady logic of surplus men and insufficient land. Iceland was settled not because a king sent settlers, but because men who had quarreled with Harald Fairhair's consolidation of Norway preferred exile to submission. Greenland was settled not because a state decided it should be, but because Eric the Red was banished from Iceland for manslaughter and sailed on. The pattern of Viking expansion was kinship-driven, feud-driven, opportunity-driven. It was the movement of individuals and families making the best decision available to them. It produced a trail of settlements across the North Atlantic, and it produced, inevitably, a man in a ship at the edge of a continent he had never seen. That man did not arrive as the representative of a civilization preparing to absorb what he found. He arrived as an individual, backed by a small group, answerable to no one beyond the kinship network that had sent him. The world behind him was real and vital and remarkable in its own terms. But it was a world that had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of the individual venture, the raid, the settlement, the personal gamble on open water. It had not developed and had not needed to develop the institutional machinery that turns a single man's landfall into an empire's first footstep. That machinery was not Norse. It would be invented somewhere else. This across 500 years that had not yet happened. The sealing of the Viking world was not a failure of courage or imagination. It was structural. The same kinship networks that made a Norse settlement in Iceland possible made a Norse colony in North America almost impossible to sustain. Because Iceland was close enough to the world that had produced the settlers, and Vinland was not. Distance revealed the limits of a civilization that had never needed a state, because distance is the one problem that only institutions can solve. A lone man's strength ends where the supply line begins, and a supply line in any meaningful sense requires something the Viking world had not yet built. By the time a Viking ship first anchored off the coast of North America, the North Atlantic had already been a Viking road for 2 centuries. The voyages that history tends to remember as bold acts of exploration were, in the experience of the people who made them, the continuation of a logic that had been running since the late 8th century. A slow, kinship-driven migration westward, one island at a time, each step following the same pressure that had produced the last. There was no royal decree behind any of it. There was no treasury funding the ships. There was surplus manpower. There was the sea. And there was always the possibility that something lay further on. The ships that carried them made it possible. The Norse Nar, the broad-hulled, deep-drafted cargo vessel that the Vikings used for ocean crossing, was among the most capable maritime instruments of the medieval world. Built from overlapping oak planks, riveted with iron, and its hull designed to flex with the movement of ocean swells rather than resist them, it could cross open water that would have destroyed a less forgiving vessel. Loaded with cattle, tools, and families, it could sustain speeds of several knots across hundreds of miles of open sea. It drew shallow enough to beach on an unfamiliar coast. It was, in every structural sense, a ship built for exactly this: the movement of people and their possessions into the unknown. Navigation across that unknown was not guesswork. Viking sailors read the ocean with a precision that had taken generations to develop. The position of the sun at midday, the angle of stars at night, the behavior of swells and wind patterns and seabirds. These were instruments as reliable, in the hands of an experienced Norse navigator, as any mechanical tool. The latitude sailing method, holding a constant degree of latitude by observing the sun's height, allowed a ship to cross the North Atlantic on a consistent heading without the aid of a compass. The knowledge was oral, accumulated over lifetimes, passed from one generation of sailors to the next. It was exact enough to find Greenland from Iceland and Iceland from Norway in any weather a ship could survive. The westward movement had begun, as most Viking movements did, with Norway. In the 9th century, Harald Fairhair, consolidated the Norwegian petty kingdoms under a single royal authority, and the chieftains who refused submission went west. Iceland received its first permanent Norse settlers around 874 AD, led by Ingolfur Arnarsson, a Norwegian farmer and chieftain who threw his high-seat pillars overboard as he neared the coast and built his farm where they washed ashore, at the bay he called Reykjavik. Within 60 years, the habitable land of Iceland was fully settled, not because a state mandated it, but because free men in their thousands had made the same calculation, that exile with autonomy was worth more than submission to a king. Iceland filled fast. By roughly 930 AD, the arable land along its coasts and river valleys was claimed, divided, and farmed. The same pressure that had driven men from Norway to Iceland now built inside Iceland itself. A new generation of settlers, or men banished from the island by its own assembly, began to look further west. Greenland was not unknown. A Norse sailor named Gunnbjörn Ulfsson had reportedly sighted land beyond the western horizon decades earlier. It was Eric the Red who went to find it. In 982 AD, banished from Iceland for manslaughter after a dispute with a neighbor left several men dead, Eric sailed west with nothing particular to lose. He spent 3 years mapping the southwestern coast of the island he had found, its fjords, its valleys, its summer pasture. Greenland was cold and treeless in most directions, but along its southwestern rim, the land opened into grass-covered inlets that could sustain livestock through the summer months. When his banishment ended and he returned to Iceland in 985 AD, he described what he had found and called it Greenland, a name chosen with a recruiter's instinct, because a man considering the long voyage across open ocean needed something better than accuracy to convince him. It worked. 25 ships departed Iceland with Eric in 985 or 986 AD. 11 turned back or were lost at sea. 14 arrived. The colony they founded on Greenland's southwestern coast, the eastern settlement and the smaller western settlement, never grew beyond roughly 2,000 to 3,000 people at its peak. It was sustained by hunting, farming, and the walrus ivory trade with Norway. The Greenland colony was the furthest permanent reach of Viking expansion. Small, dependent on supply ships from Iceland and Norway, and operating at the absolute edge of what a kinship-organized society could sustain across open ocean. Everything the Greenland settlers needed that they could not produce themselves. Timber, iron, grain had to come by ship from Iceland or further east. The colony survived because the distance was manageable and because Greenland produced something Europe wanted: walrus ivory, bearskins, live polar bears carried to Norwegian and Frankish courts as exotic gifts. It was a trade relationship, not an empire. The settlements paid their way by sending luxury goods back across the water. It was from this thin, isolated outpost that the next step westward came. In 986 AD, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson sailed from Iceland toward Greenland to spend the winter with his father, who had joined Eric's colony. Driven off course by storms and fog, he sighted 3 successive coasts that matched no description of Greenland he had been given. Wooded, flat, with gentle hills, not the rocky, glaciated island he was looking for. He turned his ship and found Greenland without landing anywhere he had not intended, but he reported what he had seen. And in the small world of the Greenland settlement, where everyone knew everyone, and news of land to the west carried enormous weight, his report circulated. Leif Erikson heard it. The son of Eric the Red, raised in Greenland, probably in his mid-20s when he organized his expedition, Leif bought Bjarni's ship, the same vessel that had sighted those unknown coasts, and in around 1000 AD sailed to find them. He reversed Bjarni's route, sailing southwest from Greenland, and made landfall on 3 successive coasts: a rocky, glacier-capped shore he called Helluland, flat stone land; a forested coast he called Markland, forest land. And finally, a place where the grass grew thick through winter and wild grapes were found along the riverbanks. This place he called Vinland. He wintered there with a crew of 35 men and returned to Greenland in the spring, bringing timber and grapes, two things the Greenland settlement could not produce on its own. What Leif had done was entirely consistent with what had been done before him. Norway to Orkney, Orkney to the Faroe Islands, Faroe Islands to Iceland, Iceland to Greenland, Greenland to Vinland. Each step followed the same logic: a known coast to the west, accessible by the ships the Vikings already possessed, reachable in a sailing season, worth investigating for the same reasons that had always driven Norse westward movement: land, timber, resources, and the restless surplus of men who had no better options at home. Vinland was not a rupture in the pattern. It was the pattern's next iteration. The difference, and it was a difference that would prove decisive, was what lay behind the man who had arrived. Every previous step in the chain had been backed, however loosely, by a world that could follow through. Norway could resupply Iceland. Iceland could resupply Greenland. The distances were long, but they were within the range of a kinship network capable of sending ships on a regular seasonal schedule. Vinland was different. It lay beyond Greenland, which already stood at the outer edge of everything. A ship sailing from the Greenland settlements to Vinland was sailing from a world of 2,000 people into a continent, and the chain that connected one step to the next had reached its last link. The Atlantic, as the Vikings understood it, was not an obstacle. It was a highway, and like all highways, it was only as useful as what lay at both ends. Between Norway and Iceland, there were populations, politics, and commerce on both sides of the crossing. Between Iceland and Greenland, there was still a living connection: ships, trade, family ties. Between Greenland and Vinland, there was Greenland on one side, and on the other, nothing that the Viking world had built. The road ran out. Not because the ships could not make the crossing, because there was nowhere on the Vinland side for the road to go. The Gnar that carried Leif Erikson to North America was as good a ship as the medieval world produced. The men aboard it were as capable as any sailors alive in 1000 AD. The navigational knowledge that brought them to those forested shores was the result of 200 years of North Atlantic experience, refined voyage by voyage until the ocean held no real mystery for the men who sailed it regularly. None of this was the limiting factor. The limiting factor was the same one that had quietly governed every step of the Viking expansion westward: the question of what the world behind the ship was capable of doing with what the ship had found. Every harbor the Vikings had established across the North Atlantic had survived because it could be fed, supplied, and reinforced by the kinship networks that had produced it. Iceland survived because Norway could reach it. Greenland survived, barely, and only for a time, because Iceland could reach it. Vinland had no one who could reach it at the scale the settlement required. The highway the Vikings had built across the North Atlantic was one of the great achievements of medieval seafaring. It simply did not extend far enough to carry the consequences of what, at its far end, they had found. Two texts preserve the Viking voyages to North America: the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, together known as the Vinland Sagas, were written down in Iceland in the early 13th century, roughly 250 years after the events they describe. They derived from an oral tradition that had been carried across that interval by the communities who remembered it: farmers, seafarers, and their descendants in Iceland and Greenland, for whom the Vinland voyages were living family history before they became written record. Both sagas agree on the broad outline of events. They disagree on details, emphasis, and sequence in ways that reveal the messiness of memory preserved across generations, and they are, despite those disagreements, the most precise European record of contact with North America, before the late 15th century. The saga of the Greenlanders begins the story not with Leif Erikson, but with a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson. In the summer of 986 AD, Bjarni sailed from Iceland toward Greenland to spend the winter with his father, who had emigrated with Eric the Red's colonizing fleet. Storms and fog drove his ship far off course to the southwest. Over several days he sighted 3 successive coasts, one low and wooded with gentle hills, one flat and heavily forested, one mountainous and partly covered with snow, none of which matched the rocky, glacier-edged island he had been told to expect. Bjarni refused to land. He turned his ship and found Greenland. He had seen a continent and decided it was not what he was looking for. The saga records this without embarrassment because the Greenland settlers understood perfectly what Bjarni had done. He had come to find his father, not a new world, and he had found him. The story passed through the small world of the Greenland settlements, a community that, at its largest, held only a few thousand people spread across a handful of farm clusters along the southwestern coast. In that world, news of land to the west moved with the speed of conversation, and Bjarni's sighting was the kind of information that did not stay quiet. Where Leif Erikson, the eldest son of Eric the Red, heard it. He bought Bjarni's ship, the same vessel that had seen those coasts, assembled a crew of 35 men, and in around 1000 AD sailed to find what Bjarni had refused to investigate. He reversed Bjarni's route, sailing southwest from Greenland, and made landfall on each of the 3 coasts in turn. Leif named them as he went. The first was Helluland, flat stone land, a barren glacier-edged shore that the sagas place at what was almost certainly Baffin Island. The second was Markland, forest land, a flat, heavily wooded coast that corresponds to Labrador. The third, where he chose to winter, was a place of thick grass, rivers full of salmon, and wild grapes growing along the banks. He called it Vinland. The meaning of the name was debated even in medieval Iceland, whether vin referred to grapes producing wine or to the Old Norse word for pasture and meadow. But the land itself was real. A coast where the grass stayed green through a winter milder than anything the Greenland settlers knew, where timber could be cut in quantities the treeless colony desperately needed, and where the land opened up in every direction. Leif wintered at a camp his crew built on the shore, a camp that later expeditions would call Leif's Booths or Leif's Budir, and returned to Greenland in the spring with a cargo of timber and grapes. The saga records his return matter-of-factly, the way it records everything. These things happened. This is the order they happened in. These are the names of the people who did them. There is no triumphalism in the Vinland sagas, no sense that a world historic moment had occurred. Leif brought back useful materials from a place he had found, and he was called Leif the Lucky, not for discovering a continent, but because on his return voyage he rescued a shipwrecked crew from a reef, which was the kind of luck that mattered in the world he inhabited. His brother Thorvald led the next expedition, using Leif's ship and wintering at Leif's camp. He spent 2 years exploring the coastline, sailing west and then north, examining inlets and headlands and stretches of forested shore. He found the land beautiful and said, in the saga's account of him, that he would like to make his home there. The encounter that ended that ambition came without warning. A group of men were found sleeping under upturned hide boats on a beach. 3 of them were killed by the Norse before the rest escaped into the water. A large force returned, hide boats covering the inlet, arrows falling on the Norse ship from all directions. Thorvald was struck by an arrow beneath his arm in the gap between the gunwale and his shield. He died on the Vinland shore and was buried there, the first European to die in North America outside Greenland. His crew returned without him. A third expedition, led by Thorstein, Leif's younger brother, never reached Vinland at all. He spent an entire summer sailing the North Atlantic and arrived back on the Greenland coast having seen nothing. He died of illness that winter. His widow, Gudrid, subsequently married a wealthy Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni, who had arrived in Greenland to trade and stayed to hear the stories that surrounded Leif's family like weather. Gudrid, by the Sagas account, pressed for the voyage herself. Karlsefni agreed, and in the years that followed, probably around 1010 AD, he organized the most ambitious Viking attempt to establish a presence in Vinland that the Sagas record. The Karlsefni expedition was different in kind from what had come before. Where Leif had brought 35 men to winter and explore, Karlsefni brought between 60 and 160 people. The accounts differ, but the intent is clear in both. This was not an exploration. It was a settlement attempt. The company included women. They brought livestock, cattle at minimum. They intended to stay. A son was born to Gudrid and Karlsefni in Vinland, a boy named Snorri, and the first child of European descent known to have been born in the Americas. For 1 full year, possibly 2, the settlement held. The sagas record the first encounters with the Skrællingar, the Norse name for the indigenous peoples they met, a word that carried connotations of smallness or wretchedness. A stranger's name that tells you nothing about the people it was applied to except what the Norse thought of them at a distance. The initial exchanges were tentative and then commercial. The indigenous people came to the settlement and traded furs for milk and red cloth, goods they had never seen and valued highly. The Norse refused to trade iron weapons, which the Skrællingar also wanted. The relationship held an uneasy equilibrium for as long as both sides could maintain it. It did not hold. The sagas offer slightly different accounts of how the violence began. An animal frightening the Skrællingar in one version, a misunderstood movement in another. But both record the same consequence. The indigenous people returned in far greater numbers than the Norse had seen before, and the settlement could not withstand the pressure. There were simply too few Norse and too many of everyone else. Karlsefni had brought enough people to build a settlement. He had not brought enough to defend one against a population whose numbers he had no way of estimating and whose territory extended in every direction beyond the horizon of his knowledge. He returned to Greenland with his family and what they could carry. The final Vinland voyage in the saga of the Greenlanders belongs to Freydis, Leif's half-sister, and it ends in a way the saga records with a plainness that makes it more disturbing than any elaboration could. Freydis sailed to Vinland with 2 Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, in a joint venture that deteriorated over the winter into a feud she manufactured and ultimately resolved through ruthless force. She ordered the elimination of the Icelanders' entire crew, more than 30 men. And when her followers hesitated to strike down the 5 women among them, she personally took matters into her own hands to ensure they met the same dark fate. She returned to Greenland with a cargo of goods and told a false story. Leif eventually extracted the truth. He said he lacked the will to punish her as she deserved, but that her descendants would not prosper. In the world the sagas inhabited, that was the worst thing a man could say. What the 2 sagas do not agree on are the details that would matter most to a historian looking for precision. The number of people on each expedition, the exact sequence of voyages, who led what, who discovered which coast first. The saga of Eric the Red collapses several expeditions into one and reassigns credit in ways that the saga of the Greenlanders flatly contradicts. Both texts were recording an oral tradition that had already been interpreted, shaped, and reshaped by 2 centuries of retelling before anyone wrote it down. What they preserve is not a transcript of events, but a community's memory of them, selective, structured, and carrying the priorities of the people who remembered. What the sagas agree on is what matters for the argument this story is actually making. Multiple voyages reached the same coasts. The land was real, its resources were real, and the people who lived there were real and numerous. The Norse built structures, cut timber, and attempted to establish a permanent presence. Every attempt to remain ended in withdrawal, not because the land was inhospitable, but because the situation was. The Skrællingar were not an incidental complication. They were the clearest signal of the structural problem the Norse faced, a continent that was already inhabited by populations whose scale the settlers from Greenland had no means of managing and no institution capable of confronting. The Sagas record failure without calling it failure. They are the accounts of people for whom these voyages were family stories, not historical catastrophes. Adventures that ended badly, like many adventures, one for reasons the people who experienced them understood perfectly well. The land was good, the distances were long, the people already there were too many. They came back. The sagas say all of this directly in a tone that expects the listener to understand without being told that sometimes a man goes somewhere and comes home again, and that is the whole of the story. The tragedy is in the gap between what the sagas describe and what the world behind those voyages was capable of doing with what they had found. These are the oldest written memories of eyes that saw the North American coast. They contain accurate sailing directions, identifiable coastlines, and a record of human encounter that holds together across two independent texts composed without reference to each other. They also contain folklore, contradiction, and the inevitable drift of oral tradition across 2.5 centuries. What they do not contain, what they were never capable of containing, is any record of a world that followed through, because no such world existed. The sagas record the full extent of what the Viking world could do with Vinland. They record everything. The sagas were oral tradition committed to parchment 2.5 centuries after the events they described. For most of the modern era, that was the only record anyone had. Remarkable texts, carefully preserved, but texts nonetheless, and texts that disagreed with each other on details that mattered. The question of whether the Vikings had actually reached North America remained, in the strictest sense, unanswered until 1960. When a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad walked into a small fishing village on the northern tip of Newfoundland, and a local resident led him to a cluster of grass-covered mounds near the shore that the village had always called the Old Indian Camp. They were not an Indian camp. They were the only confirmed Norse settlement ever found in North America. Ingstad's wife, the archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, led the excavations that followed from 1961 to 1968. What they uncovered settled the question of the Viking presence definitively. 8 buildings, constructed of timber frames covered with sod, built in a style identical to structures known from Iceland and Greenland in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The halls, the small huts flanking them, then the arrangement of the complexes on a narrow terrace above a bog and a small brook. Every architectural detail matched the settlements the Vikings were building on the other side of the Atlantic at exactly the same time. There was nothing like this structure type in any indigenous tradition of the region. The buildings were Norse because only Norse people built that way, in that period, on that plan. The objects found inside confirmed it further. Iron nails and rivets from boat repair, a floor plank from a ship's hull, smelting slag from the production of iron, the first iron manufacture known to have occurred anywhere in North America, a bronze ring-headed pin of a type worn in Viking-era Scandinavia, a soapstone spindle whorl of the late classic Norse period, the kind of tool a woman carried in her kit, fire strikers of red jasper, then 11 of them, found inside and outside every hall. The objects were few. Most of what the Norse left behind was wood, which they had worked in quantity and left in quantity. But every object was consistent with a Norse occupation in the early 11th century, and nothing was inconsistent with it. The site was what it looked like. The question of when exactly the site was occupied received its most precise answer in 2021, when an international research team examined 3 wooden pieces from the Norse occupation layers, fragments cut by metal blades, which ruled out any indigenous origin. Each piece of wood preserved its tree rings intact to the outermost layer, the bark edge. In each piece, the researchers identified the signature of a massive solar storm that had occurred in 992 AD, a global spike in atmospheric radiocarbon that showed up in tree rings worldwide as a distinct anomaly, a fixed point in time that could be counted from with precision. 28 rings from that marker to the bark edge. The trees were felled in 1021 AD. Norse hands cut timber in North America in that year, and the date is now as certain as any date in medieval history. The site occupied a narrow terrace above Epavs Bay on the northern tip of Newfoundland's Great Northern Peninsula. A small brook ran through the terrace, providing water and the bog iron that the settlement's furnace processed into usable metal. The bay offered a protected anchorage where ships could be beached at high tide for repair. The forest that stood on and around the site, fir, larch, birch, poplar, provided the timber the occupants worked in such quantities that hundreds of wood chips littered the ground around the buildings. The location was chosen by people who understood exactly what they needed: water, iron, wood, and a safe harbor. It was a functional choice, not a symbolic one. These were working people in a working camp. What the buildings could accommodate, in terms of sleeping capacity, was between 30 and 160 people. The estimates vary because the exact arrangement of sleeping platforms in each hall cannot be determined with complete certainty. What they could not accommodate, under any reasonable calculation, was a self-sustaining population. The entire Greenland colony, from which these people had almost certainly come, were held roughly 2,000 to 2,500 inhabitants at the time of the Norse occupation. The Meadows settlement, at its most generous estimate, represented perhaps 10% of that population. It was drawing people from a world that could barely spare them. The work carried out at the site tells its own story about what the settlement was for. Carpentry, boat repair, iron smelting, and smithing dominated the evidence. These were the activities of people maintaining vessels and producing tools, a base of operations for voyages that continued beyond the site itself. Butternuts were found in the Norse occupation layer, a species that does not grow as far north as Newfoundland. Someone had carried them from further south, from the Gulf of St. Lawrence region at minimum. Perhaps further, which meant that Meadows was not the end of the Vikings' reach, but a staging point along it. The site was a hub, not a destination. What it was not was a colony. There was no evidence of agriculture, no field systems, no grain storage, no structures associated with long-term food production. The Norse, who lived at Meadows, ate what they hunted, what they fished, and what they had brought with them. They repaired ships, smelted iron, worked wood, and sailed further. They did not plant. They did not build toward permanence. The absence of agriculture is not a minor detail. In the medieval world, agriculture was the foundation of every durable settlement. You could not feed a growing population, raise children into a working workforce, or accumulate the surplus that sustained institutional life without it. Meadows had none of those foundations. The occupation was short. The best estimates, drawing on the consistency of the objects and the absence of rebuilding or expansion across the structures, placed the Norse presence at the site at somewhere between 3 and 20 years. The 1021 AD date for timber felling, combined with saga accounts that place the first voyages around 1000 AD, suggests the site may have been used intermittently across 2 decades rather than continuously across 3 years. What it was not was a generational settlement, a place where children grew up, where the dead were buried and remembered, where the community put down roots deep enough to outlast the people who had planted them. And no Norse burials have been found at Meadows. No one stayed long enough to die there and be laid in the ground. The scale of the enterprise relative to the world that produced it speaks with particular clarity. Building the structures at Meadows would have required roughly 60 men working for 2 months or 90 men working for 6 weeks. In a Greenland colony of 2,000 people, that was a workforce the settlement could barely spare for the time it took to erect the buildings, let alone sustain there indefinitely. Every man wintering in Newfoundland was a man not hunting walrus in Greenland, not maintaining a farm, not contributing to the communal labor that kept the colony alive through the Arctic winter. The commitment Meadows represented was already at the outer edge of what Greenland could sustain without damaging itself. Meadows is the only confirmed Norse site in North America. Every other candidate location that has been proposed over the decades, and there have been many, has failed to produce evidence that withstands scrutiny. The site at Point Rosé in Newfoundland, identified through satellite imaging in the 2000s as a possible Norse location, yielded no Norse occupation on excavation. The Newport Tower in Rhode Island, long claimed by enthusiasts as Viking construction, is now understood to be a colonial-era windmill. The Kensington Runestone in Minnesota, a carved inscription that surfaced in 1898 and claimed to record a Norse expedition deep into the continent in 1362, has not survived academic examination. Meadows stands alone because it is the only place where the physical evidence, the structures, the objects, the iron, the dates, is complete enough and consistent enough to close the argument. That singularity is itself a finding. If the Norse had established a durable presence in North America, if they had managed the transition from base camp to colony, from staging post to settlement, from a temporary occupancy to something that could generate its own momentum, there would be more sites. Settlements leave traces. People who stay build more buildings, make more objects, clear more land, bury their dead. The Norse left one site, briefly occupied, and then left. The continent did not become part of their world. Their world was not capable of making it so. The archaeology answers the question the Sagas raised: the Vikings were here. It then answers the question the Sagas could not fully address: what being here actually amounted to. A working camp on the northern tip of Newfoundland, occupied for a decade or two, used to repair ships and smelt iron and stage voyages into waters whose full extent the occupants never mapped. A place where a handful of people, men mostly, some women, no children buried in the ground, spent a few winters doing practical work for a practical purpose, and then stopped coming. The site does not diminish the achievement of reaching it. It defines, with more precision than any written source could, the ceiling of what reaching it meant. The Norse did not arrive in an empty continent. This seems obvious stated plainly, but the assumptions embedded in how the Vinland voyages have been told, in the sagas, in later historical writing, and in the popular imagination, often treat the land as essentially vacant, a backdrop against which Norse capability and Norse failure played out. It was not. North America in 1000 AD was a populated world with its own institutional logics, its own trade networks, its own patterns of territorial use and seasonal movement, and its own capacity to respond to intrusion. The people the Norse encountered were not obstacles in a story about European exploration. They were the reason the story ended the way it did. The populations of northeastern North America at the time of the Viking contact were diverse and varied considerably, depending on how far south and inland from the Newfoundland coastline one looked. Yes, at the northern tip of Newfoundland, where Meadows sat, the Norse almost certainly encountered the Dorset people, a Paleeskimo culture that had occupied the eastern Arctic and the northern fringes of Newfoundland and Labrador for centuries. The Dorset were hunters and fishers of the cold water coast, skilled at sea mammal hunting, living in small, mobile groups, well adapted to the conditions the Norse themselves found challenging. They were not a people who could be easily fixed in one place or confronted as a concentrated force. They moved with the seasons and the animals. Further south along the Labrador coast and into the interior, the Norse would have encountered the ancestors of the Innu, hunters of the boreal forest interior, organized in kinship bands, and following caribou across landscapes that stretched west and south beyond any horizon a Viking sailor could see from his ship. These were not stateless peoples in the way that suggested disorder. Their organization was adapted with precision to the environment they inhabited. Band structures, seasonal aggregation, territorial knowledge passed across generations. These were the institutional forms that worked in a subarctic forest, just as the thing and the kinship network were the institutional forms that worked in the Norse world. Neither had developed for the other's conditions. The Beothuk, the people most associated with Newfoundland in the historical record, moved across the island in a pattern of seasonal migration between inland caribou hunting and coastal fishing and sea mammal hunting. Their world was the whole island. They were not a coastal people who happened to visit the interior, nor interior people who happened to reach the sea. They managed both, and the richness of Newfoundland's resources sustained them across that movement. The Norse, at Meadows, had arrived at the edge of a territory that people already used comprehensively and knew intimately. What the Sagas call skrailingar, a word the Norse applied to every indigenous person they met, from Greenland to the shores of Vinland, carrying connotations that told you everything about how the Norse saw these encounters and nothing reliable about the people themselves, appeared at the Norse settlement in increasing numbers as the occupation continued. The Sagas describe the initial encounters as cautious and commercial. Hide boats on the water. Now people approaching with furs to trade. The Norse offered red cloth, which the skrailingar valued. They refused to trade iron weapons, which the skrailingar also wanted. For a time, the exchange sustained a fragile equilibrium that neither side had the tools to maintain. The trading encounters illuminate something important about the indigenous world the Norse had entered. These were people who engaged in exchange. Long before European contact, the peoples of North America had developed trade networks of considerable reach. Copper from the Great Lakes appearing in burial sites in Louisiana, shells from the Gulf of Mexico turning up in Manitoba. Objects moved across the continent through networks of exchange that connected peoples who never met each other directly. In passing through intermediaries across distances that dwarfed anything the Norse trading world in the North Atlantic had achieved. The skrailingar, who came to trade at Leif's camp, were not isolated bands stumbling upon strangers. They were participants in a world of exchange that functioned on its own terms. The numbers are the factor the Sagas record with the most clarity, and they are the factor that mattered most. When the relationship between the Norse and the indigenous population shifted from cautious trade to open conflict, the skrailingar returned not in the small groups of the initial encounters, but in forces that the Norse, at their maximum strength of 60 to 160 people, could not match. The Sagas describe hide boats covering the water, arrows falling in quantities that forced the Norse behind the shields along their ship's gunwale, a continent's worth of people at the back of every encounter, and a Greenland colony of 2,000 at the back of every Norse response. The arithmetic was not close. What the Norse lacked was not courage. The Sagas record tactical resourcefulness under pressure, and Freydis reportedly drove off one attack with a terrifying display of fierce physical defiance, striking her weapon against her armor in a battle frenzy that caused a group of skrailingar to withdraw from the confrontation. But individual acts of nerve cannot substitute for the one thing the Norse did not have: the institutional capacity to manage the encounter at the scale it required. To hold territory against a population that vastly outnumbered the settlers demanded the ability to build fortifications, maintain supply lines, field a force capable of sustained defense, and project authority across a landscape. These were things states did. The Norse had no state behind them. The indigenous population of North America as a whole, at the time of the Viking contact, was almost certainly in the millions. Estimates range widely from under 1 million to several million for North America north of Mexico alone, with the population likely near or approaching its pre-Columbian peak in the century or two after the Norse voyages. Even the most conservative of these numbers placed the peoples of the continent at a scale that made the entire Greenland colony, 2,000 people at its largest, a rounding error. And the Norse were not failing to hold Vinland against a small band of hostile locals. They were failing to hold a beachhead against the outermost edge of a continental population whose interior they had no means of mapping and no concept of measuring. The Dorset world itself was changing at exactly the moment the Norse arrived. The Thule, the Proto-Inuit ancestors of modern Inuit peoples, were expanding southward and eastward from their Arctic origins, their own institutional adaptation to cold-water maritime environments giving them capabilities that would eventually displace the Dorset from Greenland itself by the 14th century. The Norse, arriving in a region where one indigenous culture was already under pressure from another expanding one, had entered not a static world, but a dynamic one, a continent in motion, a reorganizing itself on timescales and across distances the Norse settlement at Newfoundland had no way of perceiving. The trade the Sagas record between the Norse and the Skrælingjar was not a failure of diplomacy. It was a structural encounter between two systems that had no common framework for negotiating coexistence at scale. The Norse understood the world in terms of personal relationships, kinship obligations, and the negotiated authority of recognized men. The indigenous peoples of the Northeast understood it in terms of territorial use, seasonal movement, and the enforcement of boundaries against strangers who did not belong to any recognized network. Neither system provided a mechanism for absorbing the other. The Norse could not integrate into the indigenous world. The indigenous world had no reason to accommodate the Norse. What the encounter ultimately revealed was the difference between a landing and a presence. The Norse could reach the coast of North America. They could trade, winter, cut timber, smelt iron, and sail further south. What they could not do was establish the kind of presence that indigenous populations were compelled to accommodate, because that kind of presence required institutional infrastructure they did not possess. Forts, permanent supply lines, missionaries who could function as negotiators and administrators, royal authority capable of enforcing a colonial claim against a resistant population. These were the tools that would eventually make European colonization of North America possible, but they would not exist for another 5 centuries. The Skrælingjar the Sagas describe were not an aberration or an unfortunate complication, or they were the continent. The people the Norse met at the edge of Newfoundland were the nearest representatives of a world that extended west and south across distances the Norse had no means of imagining. A world with its own age, its own complexity, its own internal logic, and its own capacity to outlast a small settlement of people from the outer edge of medieval Europe. The Norse arrived at the shore of that world, traded with it briefly, fought with it briefly, and left. The world they had touched continued exactly as before, because nothing the Norse brought with them was large enough to change it. This is the most important thing the Skrælingjar tell us about the Vinland voyages. Not that the Norse were defeated militarily, though they were driven out. Not that the indigenous population was uniquely hostile. The initial encounters suggest genuine interest in exchange on both sides, but that the continent was already occupied by a world whose scale and complexity the Norse could not engage at the level required to hold territory. Courage was not the missing ingredient. Institutions were. And institutions were exactly what the Viking world, for all its extraordinary capabilities, had not yet built. The story of the Vinland voyages is sometimes told as a story of military failure. A small Norse force overwhelmed by indigenous resistance, driven from a shore it could not defend. This is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The Skrælingjar were the immediate cause of abandonment, but they were not the underlying cause of why the settlement could not hold. Beneath every clash on a Newfoundland beach was a structural problem that had nothing to do with courage or fighting skill. The Norse at Vinland were not defeated by arrows. They were defeated by the absence of everything that turns a beachhead into something durable: resupply, mandate, money, administration, and the backing of a world capable of replacing what was lost and reinforcing what remained. Begin with the supply line. Every durable settlement in the history of European expansion depended on a continuous chain connecting the outpost to the world that had sent it. A chain that carried not only food and tools, but people, and more people behind those people, and the institutional will to keep sending them. The Norse supply chain from Vinland ran through Greenland, which held 2,000 people at its peak, and from Greenland back to Iceland, and from Iceland back to a Scandinavia that had no king with any interest in or awareness of what lay 3,000 miles west of Norway. The chain was real, but it was personal, maintained by kinship and the incentive of individual voyages, not by any institutional mechanism capable of sustaining it under pressure. When the cost of reaching Vinland began to exceed what Greenland could bear, the chain simply stopped. No authority existed to compel it to continue. Distance was its own problem. Brigida Wallace, the archaeologist who led the Parks Canada excavations at Meadows and spent her career studying the Norse in North America, noted that the distance from the Greenland settlements to the resource-rich areas of the Gulf of St. and Lawrence, the region the Norse knew as the real Vinland, was nearly 2,500 kilometers. A single sailing season could cover that distance, but a settlement at that distance from its source of supply was not a colony in any functional sense. It was an outpost, and an outpost that could not be reinforced or resupplied faster than its problems could accumulate was an outpost that would fail. The Greenland colony, from which every Vinland expedition departed, was itself already at the edge of what the Viking world could sustain. It had never been self-sufficient. Greenland could grow grass and raise cattle through the summer months, but it could not produce timber, iron, or grain at the scale a settled population required. These had to come by ship from Iceland or Norway, across hundreds of miles of North Atlantic water, on ships that operated seasonally and could be lost to storms, ice, or simple neglect. Greenland survived as long as it could export something Europe wanted: walrus ivory, polar bears, furs. When the ivory trade collapsed in the 14th century, undercut by cheaper African elephant ivory and Russian walrus, the economic logic that had kept the supply ships coming dissolved, and the Greenland colony itself began the slow decline that ended in its disappearance by the 15th century. Vinland was an extension of a world that was already on borrowed time. There was no royal authority behind the Vinland voyages. This is not a minor observation. In every durable European colonial enterprise in the centuries that followed depended on a sovereign's mandate, a king or queen whose authority could compel continuation even when individual investors lost interest, whose name could be invoked to claim territory, whose legal machinery could adjudicate disputes, and whose military arm could enforce what commerce alone could not. The Norse had nothing equivalent to offer Vinland. Leif Erikson led his expedition as a private individual, using his own ship and his own people. Karlsefni funded his settlement attempt as a wealthy Icelandic merchant. No Scandinavian king sent a fleet to follow them up, because no Scandinavian king knew about Vinland in any way that produced institutional response. The land was real. The mandate to hold it did not exist. The absence of a financial instrument was equally crippling. The colonial enterprises that remade the world after 1492 were funded not by individual adventurers alone, but by structures of capital that could absorb loss across multiple voyages, pool risk among investors, and sustain expenditure over years without requiring each individual outlay to show a profit. The Norse had no such mechanism. A Viking trader who outfitted a voyage to Vinland needed that voyage to return something worth the cost. Timber was valuable in Greenland. Furs had a market. But the return on a Vinland voyage barely justified the risk of a single crossing, and nothing about the Norse financial world, no banking house, no merchant syndicate, no crown treasury, could have sustained years of investment against the horizon of a future payoff. And every voyage had to pay for itself. None of them produced enough to fund the next one at the scale settlement required. The Catholic Church, which would function as one of the central engines of European colonial expansion after 1492, was present in the Norse world at the time of the Vinland voyages, but barely, and in a form that had not yet developed the institutional machinery that made it a colonial force. Christianity had only recently reached Iceland and Greenland. There were no bishops with administrative capacity sitting in Greenland at the moment Leif Erikson sailed west. There was no ecclesiastical hierarchy capable of sanctifying a territorial claim, dispatching missionaries with letters of authority, or functioning as the administrative arm of a settlement that lacked any other governing structure. When the Spanish crown arrived in the Americas after 1492, it arrived with a papal bull already in hand, a document that declared the lands discovered to be under Christian sovereignty and gave the missionaries who followed behind the conquistadors a legal and spiritual mandate to operate. Nothing like this existed for Vinland. The church that would eventually provide that machinery was still being built. Internal discord compounded every structural deficit. The Sagas record disagreements among the Norse at Vinland with the same matter-of-factness they bring to everything else. Thorhall the Hunter wanted to sail north to find the real Vinland. Karlsefni wanted to sail south. The company split. Freydis manufactured a feud with the Icelanders on the final voyage and resolved it with an axe. These were not exceptional events in a world that ran on personal loyalty and personal grievance. A settlement that has no institutional framework beyond the authority of recognized individuals is a settlement where every disagreement is a potential dissolution because there is no structure above the argument capable of resolving it. States can survive internal conflict because they have mechanisms that outlast the individuals involved. A Viking settlement could not. The Norse strengths that had made the North Atlantic expansion possible, self-sufficiency, individual capability, kinship loyalty, navigational mastery, turned into liabilities at the scale Vinland required. A Norse settler in Iceland or Greenland was formidably capable precisely because he had to be. No state would help him, no supply chain would rescue him, and no bureaucracy would tell him what to do. He built what he needed, raised what he ate, and managed his own disputes. These were genuine virtues. But a settlement in North America did not need 50 formidably self-sufficient individuals. It needed something closer to an institution, a structure capable of coordinating labor at scale, enforcing decisions that individuals opposed, maintaining supply over years rather than seasons, and projecting authority over a territory rather than managing a farmstead. The Norse were equipped for the farmstead. The continent required the institution. The continuing Norse contact with North America after the Vinland settlement was abandoned tells its own story about what the Viking world could sustain. The Greenland colony continued to sail to Labrador, to Markland, for timber for centuries after the last attempt at settlement. A ship was recorded arriving in Iceland in 1347, blown off course on its return from Markland, carrying a cargo of wood. This was not exploration. It was resource extraction at the scale the Norse were capable of managing. Small ships, seasonal voyages, no permanent footprint. They took what the crossing could carry and came home. For 3 centuries, Markland was a Norse timber yard, visited, used, and never held. The continent absorbed the intrusion without consequence because an intrusion at that scale produced none. The contrast with what came after 1492 is not a contrast of courage or capability. It is a contrast of architecture. The Spanish and Portuguese empires that colonized the Americas were not built by better sailors or braver men. They were built by institutions, crown finance, merchant capital, ecclesiastical authority, military administration, that could absorb the cost of a failed expedition and fund the next one, that could replace a dead governor with another, that could enforce a colonial claim against a resistant population over years and decades rather than a single difficult season. These institutions did not exist in 1000 AD. They did not exist because the conditions that produced them, commercial revolution, state consolidation, interstate competition, had not yet run their course. The Norse arrived 5 centuries before those conditions matured. Every Viking strength ran out exactly where those institutions would have begun. This is the structural truth the Vinland story has been waiting to make explicit. The Norse did not fail at Vinland because they were inadequate. They failed because they were early. The world that could have followed through on what Leif Erikson found did not exist yet. Not in Scandinavia, not in Greenland, not anywhere in the Europe of 1000 AD. The beachhead collapsed not under the weight of Skrællingar arrows, though those were real enough. It collapsed under the weight of everything that was absent, the mandate, the money, the men behind the men, and the machinery that turned a single ship's landfall into a civilization's project. Every one of those absences was structural, and every one of them would be filled by a different world 5 centuries later. And the Norse contacts with North America did not end with Karlsefni's withdrawal. They simply reduced to the scale the Viking world could sustain without institutional support. Seasonal voyages for timber, occasional trade with coastal peoples, the kind of contact that leaves almost no trace because it was never intended to become anything more. For 300 years after Vinland, Norse sailors knew where the forests were. They went and took wood and came back. The continent held the knowledge of their presence the way it held the knowledge of a passing storm, as something that had come and gone, leaving the world it had touched exactly as it found it. That, more than any single factor, is what the collapse of the beachhead actually meant. What Vinland required, and what the Norse world could not provide, was the transformation of a geographic fact into an institutional project. Geography had placed a continent within the reach of Viking ships. Institutions would have been required to do anything consequential with that fact. The institutions did not exist, and so the fact remained a fact, and the continent remained a continent, and 5 centuries passed before the world behind the ship was finally ready to act. The beachhead did not just collapse. It revealed something that would take the rest of medieval history to confirm, that the age of exploration and the age of consequence are not the same age. The Norse had mastered the first. The second required a different kind of world entirely, one that the Europe of 1000 AD was only beginning, very slowly, to become. The failure at Vinland was not a Viking failure. It was a European one. The argument this story has been building toward requires a wider frame, and that frame is the state of the continent that produced the Norse, not just Scandinavia but the whole of Christian Western Europe in the year 1000 AD. Because the question is not merely why the Vikings could not sustain a colony in North America. The question is whether any European power of that era could have done what Spain did in 1492. And the answer, examined honestly, is no. Not because of individual inadequacy, but because the institutional architecture that made Atlantic Empire possible did not exist anywhere in Europe at the turn of the first millennium. The Viking world was not an outlier in this respect. It was Europe. In a Western Europe in 1000 AD was a predominantly agrarian world. The basic economic unit was the manor, a farming estate managed by a lord and worked by peasants who owed him labor, produce, and various customary dues in exchange for access to land and a degree of protection. The manor was, in the early medieval period, largely self-sufficient. It produced what it consumed, repaired what it used, and generated little surplus beyond what was needed to feed its own population and meet its obligations to the Lord above it. Long-distance trade existed, luxury goods moved between the Mediterranean and northern Europe, and merchants carried silver and silk along routes that connected Constantinople to the Rhine. But it was a thin layer of commerce over an economy that was, at its base, local, subsistence-driven, and almost entirely non-monetary for most of its participants. The Western European population of 1000 AD was roughly 24 million people, scattered across a landscape of villages, manors, forests, and marshes, connected by roads that had degraded badly since the Roman period, and by rivers that served as the primary arteries of trade and movement. The cities that had sustained Roman administration and commerce had shrunk to shadows of their former scale. Rome itself held perhaps 20,000 people in 1000 AD, down from 1 million at the empire's peak. London was a small market town. Paris was beginning to recover under the Capetians, but had nothing like the institutional density of the great Mediterranean urban centers it would become. The population was growing. It would more than double in the 3 centuries that followed. But in 1000 AD, it was still dispersed, predominantly rural, and organized at a scale that precluded the kind of coordinated, sustained institutional action that empire required. The political landscape of Western Europe in 1000 AD was one of exceptional fragmentation. The Carolingian Empire that Charlemagne had assembled at the beginning of the 9th century, the closest thing to a pan-European state the medieval period produced, had dissolved after his death into a collection of competing kingdoms and principalities that were themselves further subdivided by the logic of feudal obligation. A king in this period was not the sovereign of a territory in the modern sense. He was a lord among lords, the highest in formal rank, but perpetually dependent on the military service, political loyalty, and practical cooperation of powerful nobles who held their own land, fielded their own armies, and pursued their own interests. In France, the Capetian king who took the throne in 987 could barely enforce his authority in the countryside around Paris, let alone across the Duchy of Aquitaine or the County of Flanders. The most powerful and centralized state in the Christian world of 1000 AD was almost certainly the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople, a state that had preserved Roman administrative traditions, maintained a professional bureaucracy, and kept a standing army answerable to imperial authority. But Byzantium was an eastern Mediterranean power, and its attention fixed on the Anatolian frontier and the threat of Islamic states to its south and east. It had no presence in the Atlantic world and no capacity to project power toward it. The second most capable state in Western Christendom was probably the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of England, which had developed a relatively sophisticated tax system, a national legal framework, and administrative institutions, the shire system, the royal writ, that gave the English crown more reach than most of its contemporaries. England would be transformed by the Norman conquest of 1066, but even before that event, it was an outlier in a Western Europe defined by decentralization. Germany, or the collection of principalities and bishoprics that called itself the Holy Roman Empire, was nominally the greatest power in Western Christendom, were its emperors inheriting the mantle of Charlemagne and claiming authority over the Latin Church's temporal affairs. In practice, the Holy Roman Empire was structurally incapable of the kind of sustained, directive action that colonial enterprise required. The emperor was elected by the most powerful princes of the realm, which meant his authority depended on the consent of the very men he was supposed to govern. Every emperor who attempted to consolidate real power found himself in conflict with either the German princes, the papacy, or both. The investiture controversy, the decades-long struggle between the emperors and the popes over the right to appoint church officials, consumed enormous institutional energy through the late 11th and early 12th centuries without resolving the underlying question of where authority actually resided. The Catholic Church in 1000 AD was a real institutional presence. the most coherent administrative network in Western Europe, with bishops, monasteries, and parish churches providing a skeleton of literacy, record-keeping, and moral authority that stretched from Ireland to Poland. But the Church of 1000 AD was not the Church of 1493, when Alexander VI issued the papal bull Inter Caetera, dividing the undiscovered world between Spain and Portugal. In 1000 AD, the papacy was still negotiating its relationship with secular power, and still fighting to establish the principle of clerical independence from lay appointment, still building the administrative machinery that would eventually make it capable of sanctifying an Atlantic colonial enterprise. The tools of papal sovereignty, the canon law system, the network of legates and nuncios, the institutional capacity to adjudicate claims between competing Christian monarchies, were under construction. They were not yet operational at the scale that colonial expansion required. What Western Europe lacked in 1000 AD was not intelligence or ambition or Christian faith. It lacked the institutional density that transforms ambition into sustained action. No banking house in Europe in 1000 AD could have financed a multi-year colonial expedition the way the Genoese merchant networks financed Columbus's voyages. Then no royal treasury could have sustained the ongoing cost of a distant colonial administration the way the Spanish crown sustained the encomienda system in the Americas. No standing army existed that could have garrisoned an Atlantic outpost through years of indigenous resistance. No professional administrative class existed to govern a territory beyond the horizon. All of these institutions would eventually develop, but the process of developing them would take 5 centuries, and in 1000 AD, the process had barely begun. The Viking world was embedded in this wider European reality. When the Norse expanded into Iceland and Greenland, they were doing something that no European state of the period was institutionally equipped to manage, and they were doing it through the only means available to them: kinship networks, the personal initiative, and the accumulated navigational knowledge of 2 centuries at sea. That this worked at a certain scale is a tribute to what the Norse world had built. That it could not work at a larger scale was not a Viking failing. It was the consequence of living in a Europe that had not yet developed the institutional tools that larger-scale colonization required. No European power in 1000 AD was positioned to do better. Consider what it would have required for any European power to have followed through on a discovery of North America at the turn of the first millennium. It would have required a sovereign with the authority to mandate continued expeditions regardless of individual cost or failure. Not a feudal lord with limited power beyond his own lands, but a king capable of directing national resources toward a project that might take decades to pay off. It would have required a financial system capable of funding those expeditions across years of loss, not the thin commerce of a manor economy, but the pooled capital of a merchant class with instruments sophisticated enough to absorb risk and spread it across multiple investors. It would have required a church capable of legitimizing the territorial claim and providing administrative personnel to govern the settlement, not a church still fighting to define its own authority in relation to secular power, but one that had already established its sovereignty and systematized its reach. None of these conditions existed in 1000 AD in Scandinavia or anywhere else in the Christian world. The Norse were not the last Europeans who might have tried and failed. The Normans, descendants of Viking settlers who carved out a duchy in northern France and then conquered England in 1066, Sicily in the 1070s, and portions of southern Italy, were arguably the most institutionally sophisticated polity in Western Europe of the 11th century, combining Norse maritime tradition with a Frankish administrative inheritance. If any European power of the generation after Leif Erikson might have done something consequential with a North American landfall, the Normans are the plausible candidate. They had ships, they had a state, and they had an ecclesiastical infrastructure more developed than anything in Scandinavia. They also had no knowledge of, and no interest in, a coastline 3,000 miles to their west. The world that could have followed through did not yet know the thing worth following through on. This is the European context that the Vinland story requires to be understood correctly. The gap between what the Norse found in 1000 AD and what the Spanish exploited after 1492 is not a gap created by Viking inadequacy. It is a gap created by 5 centuries of European transformation, the slow, grinding, often brutal process by which a continent of manors and feudal fragments built the states, the banks, the churches, and the merchant networks that made Atlantic Empire structurally possible. The Norse arrived before any of that transformation was complete, not just in Scandinavia but across the whole of the European world they inhabited. They were early, and being early in history, as in most things, is the same as being alone. What the Europe of 1000 AD was capable of doing with a new continent was exactly what the Norse did: reach it, stay briefly, trade at its edges, and leave. Not because Europeans were timid or ignorant or unable to imagine anything more ambitious, but because the machinery that ambition requires, the institutional architecture of sustained colonial enterprise, was still being assembled piece by piece in the centuries that would follow. The Norse were not a failed version of Columbus. They were a preview of a capability that the world they lived in had not yet built, reaching a shore that would wait unchanged until the machinery caught up. The Western European population of 1000 AD would more than double by 1300. The towns that barely existed in 1000 would become the commercial cities of the 12th and 13th centuries. The merchants who barely had credit instruments in 1000 would be running banking houses that financed popes and kings by the 14th century. The kings who could barely enforce their authority beyond their own estates in 1000 would be sovereign monarchs controlling national revenue streams by the 15th. The church that was still negotiating its authority in 1000 would be issuing bulls dividing the Atlantic world by 1493. The transformation was real, and it was total. But in 1000 AD, it had not happened, and without it, what the Norse had found remained exactly what they had made of it: a coast, a winter camp, and a long way home. everything. On the morning of August 3rd, 1492, 3 ships left the harbor of Palos de la Frontera on the southwestern coast of Spain and turned their prows into the Atlantic. The man who commanded them was born in Genoa in 1451, the son of a wool weaver, educated by the sea and by the commercial networks of his home city, shaped by a decade in the Portuguese merchant marine and another decade in Spain, pitching a plan that almost no one believed in. He was, in almost every biographical sense, an individual, driven by private conviction, sustained by personal stubbornness, repeatedly rejected by the expert committees of 2 crowns before a combination of timing and persistence finally produced a yes. This is the version of the story that history tends to remember. Columbus the man, Columbus the visionary, Columbus against the odds. What it obscures is the most important thing about him. He was not the story. He was the leading edge of it. The system that sent Columbus west in 1492 had been assembling for 5 centuries. Its components were present in every document he carried, every title he held, every financial instrument that had paid for his ships. Understanding Columbus means understanding what was already in place before he set foot on a Bahamian beach in October 1492. Because what was in place made everything that followed not just possible, but, given the competitive logic of the moment, almost structurally inevitable. Columbus was a Genoese sailor. This was not incidental. Genoa in the 15th century was one of the financial capitals of the known world, a city-republic whose merchant banking networks extended from the Black Sea to the Atlantic coast of Spain, whose financial instruments connected capital across distances and currencies that no single investor could have managed alone. The Genoese had been involved in the Atlantic trade for decades before Columbus proposed his voyage. They had merchant communities in Lisbon, in Seville, in the Canary Islands. They had the instruments, bills of exchange, commenda partnerships, pooled capital, to fund sustained maritime enterprise at the scale that individual investors could not. Columbus moved through this world from the time he was a teenager. When he sailed west, he brought that world with him. His years in Portugal were not incidental either. Columbus had spent a decade in Lisbon, the capital of the most institutionally advanced maritime program in Europe. He had sailed Portuguese routes, worked within Portuguese commercial networks, and almost certainly absorbed the navigational knowledge that Portuguese systematic exploration of the African coast had accumulated over half a century. He knew the volta do mar, the technique of sailing out into the Atlantic to catch the trade winds back to Europe that made an Atlantic return crossing possible. He had proposed his plan to the Portuguese king before approaching the Spanish and been rejected on the grounds that the Portuguese experts correctly identified his estimate of the distance to Asia as far too low. What Portugal gave Columbus was the navigational knowledge and the institutional context against which he understood what he was proposing. The agreement he finally reached with Ferdinand and Isabella in April 1492 was not a personal contract between an explorer and a sympathetic crown. It was a legal instrument of a specific and developed type, a capitulation, a form of contractual agreement between the Crown of Castile and those who undertook enterprises on its behalf, with a format in use since the 14th century. The capitulations of Santa Fe, signed on April 17, 1492 at the military camp outside Granada, gave Columbus the titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor-General of any lands he discovered. He received a hereditary right to these titles, a tenth of all revenues, and the right to appoint officials in the new territories. This was not an improvised reward. It was a standardized legal structure for the projection of royal authority into newly claimed space, exactly the kind of document that kinship-based Viking explorers could never have produced, down because the institutional structure that produced it did not exist in the Norse world. The financing that paid for the ships came from multiple sources, assembled through the financial networks that 5 centuries of commercial development had built. The royal treasury contributed the primary funds, money drawn from revenues collected from the recently completed Reconquista campaigns. Luis de Santangel, a high official of the Aragonese court, provided a crucial portion of the initial capital and had been instrumental in convincing Isabella to override her advisor's rejection of Columbus's scheme. Genoese and Florentine banking consortia in Seville contributed further funds. Columbus himself invested a portion of his own resources. The total sum, approximately 1.14 million maravedis for the initial outfitting, was modest by the standards of what would follow, but its structure was entirely typical of the late 15th century Spanish Atlantic enterprise: royal capital, Italian banking networks, and the administrative machinery of the Aragonese court operating together under the legal framework of a royal contract. None of these elements had existed in 1000 AD. All of them had been built since. Columbus sailed with the competitive logic of the Atlantic between 2 Christian powers driving him. The Portuguese had reached the southern tip of Africa in 1488. Within years, as anyone paying attention in 1492 understood, they would reach India by the eastern route, locking up the spice trade behind a monopoly that Castile could not break. The westward voyage was not Columbus's idiosyncratic dream alone. It was a response to a competitive situation between 2 institutionally capable states, each tracking the other's progress with the intensity of rivals who understood that the first to secure the Asian trade would hold an advantage the other could not easily overcome. Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to fund Columbus, not because they were convinced by his geographical calculations — their experts had correctly dismissed those — but because the completion of the Reconquista had freed resources and attention, and because not funding him risked leaving the Atlantic entirely to Portugal. The voyage itself proceeded along navigational lines that the Portuguese program of systematic Atlantic exploration had made possible. The Columbus sailed south from Spain to the Canary Islands before turning west, using the northeast trade winds that the Portuguese had mapped in their decades of Atlantic sailing. He understood from that same body of accumulated knowledge that the trade winds would carry him west and that the westerlies at higher latitudes would carry him home. This was not individual genius. It was the application of institutionally accumulated knowledge, systematic, documented, refined over 50 years of state-directed Portuguese exploration, to a westward crossing that no individual could have conceived without the navigational foundation the Portuguese program had built. On October 12, 1492, Columbus made landfall on an island in what are now the Bahamas. As he called it, San Salvador, Holy Savior, and claimed it immediately for the crown of Castile in accordance with the legal framework of the capitulations of Santa Fe. The act of claiming was not an afterthought. It was the point. The rituals of possession, planting the royal standard, reciting the formal words of territorial annexation, recording the act in writing for presentation to the crown, were the institutional expression of a legal system that had been developing since the Crusades, refined through centuries of Iberian territorial expansion, and applied in that moment to a shore that no European legal system had previously imagined. Columbus knew exactly what he was doing, because the institution he represented told him exactly what it required. What came back to Spain with Columbus in March 1493 was not just the news of land. It was a claim, a legal instrument backed by a royal mandate and an individual who had survived the crossing and could testify to what he had found. Within weeks, Pope Alexander VI, himself a Spaniard, born in Valencia, issued the papal bull Inter Caetera, establishing a line of demarcation 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands, and granting Spain exclusive rights to all newly discovered and undiscovered lands west of that line. The bull was issued on the 4th of May, 1493. Columbus had returned to Spain in March. 6 weeks separated the news of the landfall from the papacy's formal division of the undiscovered world. The institutional machinery worked at speed because it had been operational for decades. Portugal, and which had its own accumulated body of papal authority over Atlantic exploration, immediately challenged the Spanish claim. King John II threatened war and invoked the Treaty of Alcasovas of 1479, which had granted Portugal exclusive rights to exploration south of the Canary Islands. The dispute was resolved through direct negotiation between the two crowns, producing the Treaty of Tordesillas in June 1494, which moved the line of demarcation further west and gave Portugal the territory that would become Brazil. The speed and sophistication of this legal settlement, two sovereign states dividing the undiscovered world between them through a binding treaty ratified by papal authority, was itself the demonstration of how far the European institutional world had come since the year 1000. The Norse had had no mechanism for making or enforcing a territorial claim of any kind. Spain and Portugal settled the ownership of continents they had not yet fully explored by means of international law. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Americas. He died in 1506, still convinced he had reached the eastern margins of Asia, never fully understanding what he had actually found. His geographical error did not matter, because the system behind him did not depend on his understanding. The Spanish crown had the legal framework, the administrative personnel, and the financial backing to pursue what he had found, regardless of what he believed it was. Within a decade of his first landing, Spanish administrators were governing territories in the Caribbean. Within 3 decades, Cortés had dismantled the Aztec Empire. Within 50 years, silver from the mines of Potosi in what is now Bolivia was flowing into the Spanish treasury at a scale that reshaped the European money supply. Columbus had pointed the system. The system had done the rest. The question this raises, the question that the entire Vinland story is designed to answer, is what made the system capable of doing what it did. Columbus was not a better sailor than Leif Erikson. His ships were not categorically superior to the Norse Knar. The distance from Spain to the Bahamas is roughly the same as the distance from Greenland to Newfoundland. The ocean crossing was not the achievement. The achievement, the one that separated 1492 from 1000 in every consequence that followed, was what happened after the ship landed. What happened was the system, the crown that kept sending ships, the church that provided the legal justification for territorial sovereignty, the merchant networks that funded sustained enterprise, the administrators who governed what was found, and the legal instruments that converted a single man's landfall into a civilization's project. The Norse had a man. What Columbus had was all of that, assembled behind him over 5 centuries, waiting for exactly the moment the ship touched shore. Every institution that the Viking world lacked was present in the harbor at Palos on the morning of August 3, 1492. The mandate was in the capitulations signed by Ferdinand and Isabella. The money was in the accounts of Genoese banking consortia in Seville. The legal framework was in the canon law tradition that the papacy would invoke within weeks of the landfall. The navigational knowledge was in the accumulated charts and pilot books of 5 decades of Portuguese Atlantic exploration. The culture of territorial conquest was in the habits of men whose grandfathers had fought in the Reconquista. Columbus himself was merely the person at the front of all of this, which is the most important thing to understand about him. He was indispensable, and he was replaceable. The system that sent him was neither. This is the structural truth that the Norse voyages illuminate by contrast. The system behind Columbus was not assembled to produce Columbus. It was assembled by 5 centuries of commercial expansion, state consolidation, ecclesiastical development, and the competitive pressure of interstate Atlantic rivalry, processes that had been running for reasons entirely unrelated to the existence of a continent waiting to be found. Columbus walked into a world that had, by the logic of its own development, become structurally capable of following through on an Atlantic landfall. The Norse walked into a world that was not. In both cases, the world determined the outcome. The men were almost beside the point. Leif Erikson and Christopher Columbus were both capable navigators who crossed an ocean and found a continent that most people in their own world had no knowledge of. The difference between them is not in what they did when the ship touched shore. It is in what the world behind the ship was capable of doing with what they had found. Leif found Vinland, and the world did nothing. And Columbus found the Bahamas, and a system that had been waiting for exactly this moment, one that was structurally incapable of not following through, did everything. There is a version of this story that ends with Columbus on a beach in the Bahamas and the Norse somewhere in the background. A footnote to the main event, a curiosity, a near miss. That version is wrong. What the Norse accomplished was not a near miss. It was a proof. Leif Erikson's landfall, around 1000 AD, demonstrated something that 5 centuries of subsequent European history would eventually confirm: that a European reaching the shores of North America was, in itself, nothing. The act of arrival was the least consequential part of the story. What mattered, what has always mattered, and in every case where a discovery reshaped the world versus vanished into silence, was the network behind the ship. A discovery is a network effect. This is the argument the Vinland story has been making from the beginning, and it is time to make it explicit. The word discovery implies a single event, a moment of first contact, a man on a beach, a new shore. But that moment is only the beginning of a causal chain, and the causal chain only runs as far as the network behind it can carry it. Leif Erikson's chain stopped almost immediately because the network behind him, a dispersed kinship society operating at the outer edge of the medieval European world, with no state, no church as colonial machine, no capital instrument, and no surplus population capable of sustained colonization, could not carry it further. And Columbus's chain ran for centuries and remade the world because the network behind him had the institutional density, the financial capacity, the legal machinery, and the sovereign mandate to follow through on exactly what he had found. The same physical act produced opposite outcomes. This is the fact that the conventional telling of the Vinland story cannot explain. It falls back on timing. Columbus arrived at a more receptive moment. The Norse arrived too early. But timing is not an explanation. It is a description. The question is why the moment of 1492 was different from the moment of 1000. What had actually changed in the 500 years between those two landfalls to make one consequential and the other not? The answer is not in the man. It is in the network. What changed was the entire institutional architecture of the European world. By 1492, Europe had assembled what it lacked in 1000, centralized monarchies capable of directing sustained enterprise across generations, financial networks capable of pooling capital and absorbing the loss of individual voyages, a Catholic Church operating as a sovereignty-granting machine with legal instruments capable of adjudicating competing territorial claims between Christian powers, a culture of territorial conquest honed over centuries of Iberian warfare that understood how to convert a new coast into a colonial domain, and an information infrastructure, the printing press, capable of making geographic knowledge institutional. None of these elements existed in 1000 AD. All of them were in place by 1492. Together, as they constituted a network that was structurally incapable of not following through on an Atlantic landfall. The Norse network was not weak. This must be stated clearly because the argument is not that the Vikings were inadequate. Their ships were extraordinary, the most capable ocean-going vessels of the medieval North Atlantic. Their navigational knowledge was exact, accumulated over 2 centuries of sailing routes that no other European civilization could match. Their seamanship was without equal on the open water. Their social organization, kinship networks, assembly governance, the culture of individual capability and self-sufficiency was precisely adapted to the conditions it had evolved within. The Norse world was not a failed version of something better. It was a successful version of itself. Its ceiling was simply lower than what North America required. That ceiling was structural. The Viking world had not developed, and had no reason to develop within the conditions that had produced it, the institutional machinery that sustained colonization required. A kinship network can populate an island. It cannot hold a continent. A chieftain's authority can organize a voyage. It cannot mandate a resupply chain across 3,000 miles of open ocean. A pagan religious tradition without institutional organization can inspire individual courage. It cannot sanction territorial sovereignty in a legal framework recognized by other powers. The Norse had everything that made the crossing possible. They lacked everything that made the consequence possible. And consequence, not crossing, is what discovery actually means. The question of agency haunts this story and deserves a direct answer. Did Leif Erikson make history? Did Columbus? The structural argument that what mattered was the network, not the individual, might seem to reduce the explorer to an irrelevance. But this is not quite right. Columbus mattered. Leif mattered. What they did was real and took genuine capability. The structural point is not that individuals are irrelevant, but that their relevance is bounded by the system they inhabit. A great sailor in a world without the institutional architecture to follow through on what he finds will leave no lasting trace. A competent sailor in a world with that architecture will change everything. The difference is not between great men and ordinary men. It is between networks that can act and networks that cannot. This has a more unsettling implication that the story earns the right to state. If discovery is a network effect, if what matters is the institutional architecture behind the explorer rather than the explorer himself, then the consequences that followed from 1492 were not the product of Spanish virtue or European superiority. They were the product of a particular kind of institutional development that had accumulated in Western Europe over 5 centuries, for reasons that had nothing to do with the Americas and everything to do with internal European pressures, commercial competition, military rivalry, the consolidation of state power, the development of financial instruments, the expansion of ecclesiastical authority. The continent was not conquered because Europeans were better. It was reshaped because the network behind a particular subset of Europeans had developed at a particular historical moment, a particular set of capabilities. The network was the cause. The conquest was the consequence. The Norse understood what had happened to them. The Sagas record failure without dramatizing it, not because the authors lacked literary ambition, but because the people who preserved these stories lived in a world that understood perfectly well why Vinland had not worked out. The land was good. The distance was long. The people already there were too many. The network behind the settlement was too thin. These were not mystifications. They were accurate assessments of a structural situation, articulated in the only language available to people who had no concept of institutional architecture because they had never needed one. The sagas are precise about what happened. They simply cannot say why in the terms this analysis requires, because those terms were not available in 1000 AD to the people who lived the events. The history of the world is full of moments when a capability existed before the network that could use it was ready. The Norse built ships that could cross the North Atlantic before the European world had built the institutions that could make that crossing consequential. Gutenberg printed books before the Reformation gave the printed word its world historical role. And the medieval Islamic world developed algebraic mathematics before the European scientific revolution created the institutional context in which that mathematics could be applied at scale. In every case, the capability arrived before the network. In every case, the network determined the consequence. The Norse voyages are simply the most vivid example of this pattern, because the gap between the capability and the consequence is so large and so precisely documented. What does this mean for how we understand the age of exploration itself? The conventional story tells it as a story of European initiative, brave men, visionary monarchs, the courage to sail into the unknown. That story is not false. The bravery was real. The vision was real. But it is incomplete in a way that distorts understanding. The age of exploration was not primarily the product of individual initiative. It was the product of a network that had reached a state of development at which sustained long-distance enterprise became not just possible, but structurally self-reinforcing. Each successful voyage providing the knowledge, the financial return, and the competitive incentive for the next. Once the Portuguese began the systematic exploration of the African coast in the 1420s, the logic of the process was almost impossible to arrest, not because individual explorers were irreplaceable, but because the network that sustained them had developed the institutional momentum of a system following its own internal logic. This is what the Norse voyages illuminate by negative example. A single man's discovery cannot generate institutional momentum if there is no institution capable of experiencing it. Leif Erikson's landfall generated stories, remarkable, precise, geographically accurate stories that survived in oral tradition for 2 centuries before being written down. What it did not generate was institutional momentum, because the world that received the news of Vinland had no mechanism for converting that news into sustained action. The Greenland colony talked about Vinland, sailed to it for timber, attempted to settle it, and then stopped. The world beyond Greenland, Iceland, Norway, the broader European world, received garbled accounts of a land to the west and did nothing with them, because doing something with them would have required exactly the institutional machinery that did not yet exist. 500 years later, Columbus's landfall generated institutional momentum immediately. Within weeks of his return, the papal bull, the legal instruments, the follow-on expeditions, the administrative apparatus. The same information, there is land across the ocean, produced entirely different consequences because the network that received it was entirely different. The information had not changed. The network had. That is the whole of the explanation. The argument closes where it opened, on the beach. 2 men separated by 5 centuries, each stepping from a ship onto a shore that no European in the world they came from had ever stood on before. One of them left almost no trace. One of them started a process that remade the political geography of the entire planet. But the difference between them was not in the step onto the shore. It was in everything that stood behind them when they took it. The networks, the institutions, the machinery of states and banks and churches and merchant houses that were either present or absent, either capable of following through or not. History did not turn on the courage of the explorer. It turned on the readiness of the world he represented. The Norse reached America first. This is true, and it matters, and it deserves the precision and the seriousness that it has now been given. But the discovery that changed nothing is not a lesser story than the discovery that changed everything. It is a more instructive one, because it reveals, with a clarity that no successful colonial enterprise could provide, the mechanism by which discoveries become consequential. Not courage, not luck, not the character of the man who stepped ashore, the network behind him, what it was capable of doing, how far it could carry the chain of consequence, and whether the world it represented was ready to act on what it had found. Leif Erikson found a continent, and the world behind him could not move. Columbus found a continent, and the world behind him could not stop. That difference, not between the men, but between the worlds, is the argument this story has been making from the beginning. And it is the reason the Norse voyages matter, not despite their failure to change anything, but because of it. The discovery that changed nothing is the key to understanding every discovery that changed everything.